Welcome to this Barisco tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to create an overlay in Barisco. It is important that you have basic working experience with Barisco in order to understand this tutorial. An overlay is a general term for a group of objects that can be displayed at some point in time when it becomes necessary to display it. An overlay can be implemented in many slightly different ways. For example, in some instances an overlay could be called a pop-up, dialog, or window. Let's get started with the first part of this tutorial. A common way to create an overlay is to use the following objects: a background, content wrapper, content background, and a close button. The first part, the background, can be made using a rectangle. The size of the rectangle doesn't really matter, since we need to modify the position constraints so that they will maintain a top, left, right, and bottom position. Make sure that all the position constraints have been configured to 0. Let's also name our background background. The background is currently black, but of course you can give the background any desired color. We should also add some opacity to the background so that the content behind the overlay can be seen through the background. Next we need to create a group which will serve as the wrapper for the whole overlay. To do this you need to make sure that you have the background selected and then click on Group at the ribbon menu. As you can see at the Layers panel, our background has been wrapped inside a newly created group. Now let's also name the wrapper Overlay. As you can see, the position constraints of our overlay are not correct. These should be the same as those of the background. So let's also set up the overlay with the top, left, right, and bottom constraints. The next thing to do would be to make the content wrapper. To make the content wrapper, we need to use a group. But to make a group, you first need to select an object. Because of this, we will make the content background first. So once again, we will draw a rectangle. Let's also immediately name our rectangle content background. The size I will set to 600 by 500. Now that the content background has been created, let's move on to the content wrapper. Making the content wrapper means that we need to select the content background and then click on Group at the ribbon menu. And let's name it correctly. We also need to change the position constraints to vertical and horizontal, and then set the values to 0 and 0. This will make sure that the content wrapper will always be placed at the center of the overlay. Now that our content wrapper has been created, let's move on to the close button. For our close button, We'll use a cross icon, which we will place at the top right corner of our content wrapper. In my library I have the icon, and what I will do now is drag the icon onto the stage area inside the content wrapper. Looks like it's not in the content wrapper. Okay, and let's also change the content background color to white. Of course you can use your own icon, or even just use a text-based X instead of using an image. We need to make sure that the icon will be positioned at the top right corner of the content wrapper. This will also be convenient in case we need to resize the content wrapper. So let's change the position constraints to top and right, and then set both properties to 10 pixels. And let's also name the icon, or in fact name our close button. As you can see, our overlay is really starting to take shape. The content of the overlay will be placed here in the center of the content wrapper. Next, let's go and add the interaction that we need to close our overlay. And if you are not familiar with interactions in Barisco, please watch our interactions tutorial. To close our overlay, we need to add an interaction to the close button. So make sure that the close button is selected, and then click on the Add Interaction icon at the interaction section of the property panel. The interaction that we want to use is a mouse click, and since this is the default interaction when adding an interaction, we can just leave it like this. The target is the overlay, because the overlay is what we want to close. So at the target I will select overlay as the target. And the action that we need to use is the visibility action. By default, the visible property at the visibility action is not enabled. That basically means that the target will be set to invisible, and that is exactly what we need to do. So we can just leave everything like this. Click on apply. The last thing to do for our overlay is to disable the visible property of the overlay. We need to do this because we want the overlay to be hidden at first, and then when we click on something, the overlay should be made visible. So what I will do now is select the overlay from the layers panel and then disable the visible property. As you can see, the overlay is still here. This is because the visible property is not the same as showing or hiding a layer from the layers panel. Now that this is done, the basic setup for the overlay is ready. If we look at the preview now, the page shows up entirely empty. This of course is because we disabled the visible property. All we now need is a button which will trigger the interaction that will make the overlay appear. So I will now add an image to the stage area that will serve as a button. Also make sure that the overlay is the layer that's on the most top side of the layers panel, else the red button will appear on top of the overlay, and that of course is not what we need. The interaction that we need to add will trigger the visibility action, but this time we will set the visible property at the action to enabled. So now we need to click on the add interaction icon, and the action, interaction that we need is mouse click again. The target again is the overlay, and the action that we need is visibility, but this time we will enable the visible property. Let's click on apply and see how our page looks like. So now when I click on the button, the overlay will appear. We can close the overlay now by clicking on the close button. Let's do that again. And I cannot click anywhere except on the close button. Our overlay is currently empty, so let's go and add some content to our overlay. Any content that you want to add to the overlay should be added inside the content wrapper. This way the content will always stay in the right position, no matter the size of the user's browser. You can add the contents of the overlay directly to the content wrapper, but if you want to be able to scroll through the contents, you should add a scroller instead, and then add the contents to the scroller. So let's add a scroller to the content wrapper and call it scroller. And set the position constraints to top, left, right and bottom. Next we need to add some content to our scroller so that we can see how our overlay with the scroller looks like. I've used lipsum.com to generate some random lorem ipsum paragraphs. So I will just select and copy this text and then create a text object and paste the text inside the text object. Just make sure that it's not protruding on the right side. And let's also add some images. Okay, now that our overlay has some contents, let's test it. So just click on the red button, and here is the overlay with the scroller and the contents inside. Animating overlays can be done in various different ways. In this tutorial we're going to use the timeline animation. The first thing to do is to add the timeline animation to the overlay. We can do this by selecting the overlay and then opening the animation panel. By default the animations panel opens in the preset animation mode. Since we're going to use the timeline animation mode, we first need to click on Switch to Timeline. And the first thing that we have to do here is add another keyframe at the first second, and next we need to change the opacity of the first frame to 0%. The timeline that we have set up now will start with 0% opacity and then transition to 100% opacity by the time the second has passed. We also need to make sure that the timeline does not start playing by itself. To do this, we need to disable autoplay. The next thing to do is to add the play at frame action to the existing interaction of the red button. So at the interactions dialog, we need to enable the play at frame action. The visibility action was already enabled previously when we created the overlay. So the play at frame action is now an additional action that we're adding to the interaction. And for the play at frame action, we need to start playing the timeline at frame 0, and since this is the default setting, we don't need to change anything here. So let's go and apply this and have a look at the preview to see our overlay with the animation. So as you can see, the overlay appears and it is fading in, and this of course is because of the timeline animation that we have added. This concludes the video tutorial on how to create overlays or pop-ups in Barisco. Please also watch our other video tutorials on barisco.com/tutorials. Thank you for watching.